Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's program of the Commonwealth Club of California. We are so pleased that you're here with us. I'm Gloria Duffy, President and CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs, and we'd like to thank the Bernard Osher Foundation for supporting today's program in our Good Lit series. It is my great pleasure to introduce Ambassador John Sullivan, author of Midnight in Moscow, a memoir from the front lines of Russia's war against the West. Over his distinguished career, Ambassador Sullivan has served 5 presidents in prominent diplomatic and legal positions, including serving as U.S. ambassador to the Russian Federation under both Presidents Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Before he took up his post in Moscow, Ambassador Sullivan served for almost 3 years as the U.S. Deputy Secretary of State. He's currently a partner in the law firm Mayer Brown, LLP, and a member of the congressionally chartered Bipartisan Commission on Reform and Modernization of the Department of State. A reminder to you and our audience, if you have any questions for Ambassador Sullivan, please submit them in the YouTube chat and we'll get to them later in the program. Ambassador Sullivan, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for your service during an extremely challenging period of time.
Well, thank you, Gloria. It's great to be with you today. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Me too, and I know our audience is too. Well, let's start with this. You're an attorney, not a career diplomat, although you almost qualify for having a full diplomatic career at this point. But you weren't the first member of your family to serve as an ambassador. Tell us about your uncle, Bill Sullivan.
Oh, one of my favorite topics. So my uncle, my father's brother, Bill Sullivan, was a career Foreign Service officer. He and my father both served. They were World War II U.S. Navy combat veterans. He came back, and on the GI Bill, he'd already gotten his college degree. He got a master's degree from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts, and then joined the Foreign Service in 1947. Had a distinguished 32-year career in the service, and his last post, he was the last U.S. ambassador to Iran. He was recalled by President Carter in late spring of 1979, so he was not in Tehran when the American hostages were taken at the embassy on November 4th. It was his staff that was taken hostage. So I grew up with a perspective on the Foreign Service that a lot of people would not otherwise have through him and my cousins and their family, and the lives they lived around the world as American diplomats, including in some dangerous and hostile places like Tehran in 1979.
He just missed the capture of the U.S. Embassy staff.
Right. He would have been held hostage. Which would have been an elevation. It was already a significant blow to the United States, but to have the American ambassador, whoever it was, held hostage, that would have been an even further escalation. So
it sounds like his model of answering the call to service influenced you somewhat, so that when you got the call, you responded?
Oh, absolutely. I always wanted to serve in government. I followed. This was back in the early 1980s. And for my classmates who weren't smart enough and talented enough to go to medical school, for those of us who weren't doing well in mathematics and organic chemistry, the beaten path seemed to be to law school. And so I went to law school, but I always had in the back of my mind serving in government. And I clerked for a couple of years. I was fortunate to clerk for a great U.S. Court of Appeals judge, John Minor Wisdom, and then for a Supreme Court Justice, David Souter. But I went to work in the Justice Department and made a conscious choice to work. I had an opportunity to be a prosecutor, but I went to work instead in a small office at Main Justice in D.C., the Office of Legal Counsel, which advises the Attorney General and on issues involving national security. And when I was there, the U.S. was involved in the Persian Gulf War, Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm. So it's always been an interest of mine. I got into government as a lawyer, but gradually drifted from giving legal advice to being a policymaker and then an ambassador.
So when did the call come for you? I think it was to serve as Deputy Secretary of State. And how did
Right.
it come to you? And what did you think? And why did you take up the
Well,
challenge?
yeah, it was. So I had served in the two Bush administrations, President George H.W. Bush at the Justice Department, and then President George W. Bush, first at the Defense Department, again as the Deputy General Counsel of the department, a legal position. And then I moved over to the Commerce Department, a promotion to be the General Counsel of that department, and then Deputy Secretary of Commerce in the second half of President Bush's second term. And I thought that would be the capstone of my government service, my public service career. And the 2016 election, I hadn't been involved in the Trump campaign, but I got a call out of the blue on behalf of General Mattis, Jim Mattis, who was at that point, President Trump had picked to be his Secretary of Defense. And General Mattis asked whether I would be willing to go back into government and work for him at the Pentagon as the General Counsel of the Department of Defense. And I know General Mattis knew him and knew of his reputation, and it was a great honor to be asked by him. And I said, sure. And as I describe in the book, it was through General Mattis that I was introduced to the Trump transition. And getting involved in that, I met the Secretary of State nominee, Rex Tillerson. And I'll make a long story short by saying eventually Tillerson and Mattis did a deal, and Tillerson asked if Mattis would let me be the Deputy Secretary of State, and that now Secretary Mattis said, sure. So that's how I wound up originally coming into the Trump administration to be the senior lawyer at the Department of Defense working for Jim Mattis. But before I got confirmed, I was nominated. But before I got confirmed, my nomination for that position was withdrawn. And I was nominated and confirmed to be the Deputy Secretary of State, a pretty big change in the type of job I was taking on.
So, as you mentioned, there are usually two deputy secretaries of state, one for administration, one more for policy. Your job combined the two of them. What
Right.
were the major issues you dealt with during those 3 years as deputy secretary of state?
So you're right. I'll give you just a quick bit of background. It's varied from Republican administrations to Democratic administrations. There are two deputy secretary positions authorized by statute, as you note. Republican administrations, starting with Secretary Powell and continuing through Secretary Rice and Secretaries Tillerson and Pompeo, have decided that they wanted one deputy, which is the model in every other cabinet department, and didn't fill the second deputy position, which is known as the Deputy for Management and Resources. Democrats, starting with Secretary Clinton and continuing through Secretary Kerry and now Secretary Blinken, have decided to fill that position. So there are two deputy secretaries. I had the opportunity to serve as just the Deputy Secretary of State. And what made the job difficult, it wasn't that there wasn't it wasn't the absence of that second deputy. It was that we hadn't gotten confirmed a whole bunch of other political appointees across the department, undersecretaries of state, assistant secretaries of state. So it was a very small group of us who had been confirmed by the Senate, who held senior positions at the department, who were managing the nation's foreign affairs. My good friend, a career ambassador, senior foreign service officer, Tom Shannon, was our undersecretary for political affairs. I mean, he and I at the top leadership of the department, there should be, to give you some perspective, there are 6 undersecretaries of state and somewhere between 45 and 50 assistant secretaries of state below them. For a big chunk of my time as deputy secretary, we had only one of those 6 undersecretary of state positions filled. So when you ask what I was, it was just going from one problem, one crisis to the next, trying to keep the department functioning, managing the department, addressing issues that were coming up at posts abroad, and also trying to implement the changes that President Trump wanted to U.S. foreign policy. So it was as I lay out in the book, it was a very stressful, round the clock, 7 days a week job. And after 3 years of it, I was pretty burned out.
Well, it struck me that by January of 2020, when you left to take up your post in Moscow, it seemed like you were looking forward to leaving Washington. And, not that many people look forward to going to Moscow, but
Yeah.
And I think you also mentioned it had something to do with ice hockey, but that you.
Oh, yeah, there are a lot of things that influenced my decision to go to Moscow. So I'm happy to give you some of the background. So as I said, Gloria, I was pretty burned out after 3 years as deputy secretary, and our ambassador at the time in Moscow, my friend John Huntsman, Ambassador Huntsman, former Governor Huntsman, came back to Washington in mid-2019 to tell the president and Secretary Pompeo and me that he was going to leave his post in Moscow in the fall of 2019 to return to Utah to run for governor again. So that position was becoming open. And it was about that time when I'm feeling burned out that I was thinking about doing something else myself. And so as I describe in the book, I didn't tell others at the time, I've always been a Russophile, an amateur student of Russian history, a follower of Russian ice hockey, Soviet ice hockey, because I'm from New England, from the Boston area, and a pretty rabid hockey fan and player and youth hockey coach. So there were a lot of things that attracted me to both living in Moscow, which I was interested in doing, and serving in Moscow because the Russian Federation is involved in virtually every significant foreign policy issue that the United States has. So I could continue to contribute to U.S. foreign policy and defending U.S. national security interests, but also get my fix of Russian culture, the Russian people, and so that's what attracted me to the position. It's an unusual move. It's rare for someone who was the Deputy Secretary of State to leave that position to be an ambassador. The last person to do that had done it sometime in the early 1970s and left to be ambassador to France. President Trump, when I spoke to him about it, he had first thought that Secretary Pompeo was trying to force me out of my position, and he told me that I didn't have to leave, that he wanted me to stay if I wanted to stay. And I assured him that, no, I really did want to go to Moscow. And when he realized that Mike Pompeo wasn't forcing me to leave, that I really did want to go to serve there, he looked at me like I was crazy. And he basically, you really want to go there? And I said, yes, Mr. President, I do. Fast forward to 2021, and one of my first meetings in person with President Biden, after I had been serving as his ambassador at that point for about 6 months, we were chatting at the White House, and I was getting ready to head back to Moscow. And he said, "You're looking forward to going back, huh?" And I said, "Yes, sir, getting back to my post." He said, "You really like it over there?" And I said, "Yes." And he had the same reaction that President Trump did, that you really want to do this, huh? And I said, "Yeah, I really want to do it."
So, minor note here, you said you packed your hockey sticks in your bag.
Yeah.
I think you had some ideas you were going to play some ice hockey in Russia. Did you actually do that?
So briefly, but the pandemic shut that down. So some of my colleagues at the embassy played in a couple of men's leagues in Moscow with Russian Muscovites, senior men who play ice hockey. And I brought my hockey bag and my equipment and my sticks, bought a new pair of skates, and was looking forward to playing. I went to the rink a few times. I arrived in early January of 20, and within a matter of months, the pandemic had shut everything down, and we wouldn't allow anyone, including my colleagues who were playing in hockey leagues, to go into locker rooms at an ice arena during the pandemic. So we did set up during the winter at the embassy an outdoor rink, small rink that I got to skate on, and we had pickup games with some of the Marines on the compound and some of the kids. So that was fun, but I never got to play the way I was hoping to because of the pandemic.
Talk to us a little bit about the pandemic. How did it unfold in Moscow? How did the
Yeah.
Russians deal with it? How did you deal with it?
So we at the embassy, we were fortunate. Our medical officer, senior medical officer for the embassy, happened to be an infectious disease specialist. So she was able to really give us some good guidance long before, I'm talking early February, before there was, global recognition of the problem we were dealing with. So we were pretty well prepared. And our approach was, we adopted an approach similar to what the NHL and the NBA did, try to create our own little bubble, try to isolate our embassy as much as possible from the city that surrounded us, Moscow, limited the number of people who were able to come onto the embassy compound. And we did a pretty good job. We had, fortunately, no fatalities, either among our American staff or this is at the embassy, or third country nationals, Russians who worked for us. We did lose a wonderful man who worked for us in Vladivostok at our consulate there, a Russian who died in December of 2020. But it was, the pandemic shut down the functioning of American diplomacy in the Russian Federation. I couldn't travel. There were no more in-person meetings with Russian government officials, many of whom were themselves getting sick and being hospitalized. So then shifting to what was going on in Russia, in Moscow, early on in the pandemic, the Russian government was pretty good about imposing restrictions across the Russian Federation, and in particular in Moscow, that were enforced. So there were, the businesses were closed, and they imposed restrictions, for example, that people couldn't walk more than X number of meters from their home or their apartment. And this led to one incident. Russians love dogs, and I'm a dog lover myself. And there was a scandalous episode in early April where a Muscovite had taken his dog for a walk and had strayed too far from his apartment, and he was arrested. And the police took him and tied up his dog to a telephone pole and left the dog. The outrage among Muscovites, not that the guy was arrested, but that they had left the dog, which I agreed with them about. But it gives you a sense of they really were serious about their response to the pandemic. That changed in May and June of 2020. And it changed for political reasons that President Putin, there were two important things for him in the spring. The first was he had planned for a long time to have a magnificent Victory Day parade in the Great Patriotic War, the 75th anniversary of the Russian-Soviet victory in the Great Patriotic War, and they celebrated on May 9th. And he had also introduced constitutional reforms in January, and there was going to be a plebiscite to vote on his constitutional reforms. Among the reforms was the one that amended term limits to allow him to serve two more 6-year terms. The pandemic shut those down. So the parade didn't go forth on May 9th. The vote didn't happen. But there was pressure that Putin was applying at the Kremlin to say, we need to do these things. And I remember thinking and reporting to Washington, we were curious as to how they were going to handle this. Were they going to sacrifice public health to have a parade and a vote on these constitutional questions? Or were they going to say, and this is what actually happened, the mayor of Moscow, well, let me step back. There was an announcement after May 9th that the parade was rescheduled for June 24th. And that the day after, a couple of days after, there would be 3-day voting on the constitutional questions. But there was still a strict lockdown in Moscow. And so we debated among ourselves at the embassy, how are they going to pull this off? Well, lo and behold, the mayor of Moscow, Mayor Sobyanin, announced on June 10th, exactly 2 weeks before the parade, on June 24th, miraculously, the COVID statistics in Moscow were improving dramatically. And the strict lockdown regime was no longer going to be necessary. And by gosh, we were going to have the parade and we could have the vote on the constitutional referenda. And that's what happened. And I went to the parade, by the way.
Interesting and not uncharacteristic.
Yes.
So the release of detainees is on our minds a lot this last week.
Mm-hmm.
Once you got to Moscow, you spent quite a bit of time on detainees. And even before you got to Moscow, that's a perennial issue in U.S.-Russian relations. There was one detainee, Paul Whelan, who actually was just released this past week, who you spent quite a bit of time on, met with, visited in his detention, and so on. Tell us about that case, any other cases of detainees, how they unfolded during your time as ambassador.
Yeah, Gloria, it was one of the most important issues I worked on as ambassador, and very time consuming and appropriately so. Paul Whelan was arrested at the end of December of 2018. He was charged with espionage. It was a complete sham. He was set up. He had come to Moscow to attend a friend's wedding, and someone slipped a thumb drive to him that that he hadn't asked for, and he was set up and arrested. He was prosecuted in a secret trial. It was so secret that the prosecutors wouldn't even share some of the evidence with Paul and his defense team so that they could defend him. But I followed the case very closely because we in the U.S. government knew the Russians had charged him with espionage and said he was a U.S. spy, and we knew that was not so. He was being set up, had been set up. So starting when I was deputy secretary, I followed his case very closely, engaged with the Russian government to see if we could talk them into doing right by Paul, which was just not possible. So when I became ambassador, it was one of my highest priorities to look after Paul. He was still in pretrial detention in Lefortovo prison in Moscow in the custody of the FSB, which is the security, one of the principal successor to the KGB. And I visited Paul as often as I could. I followed his trial. I would go, there would be a secret court proceeding, and I'd be barred admittance to the court, but I'd stand outside and give a press conference and say what a sham this is. And Paul was convicted, not surprisingly, and sentenced to 16 years in a labor camp. And once he was convicted and sentenced, he was moved to a labor camp, IK-17, in Mordovia, which is roughly an 8-hour drive southeast of Moscow. So it was difficult to get to see him, but I made sure that I got down there as often as I could. It was an 8-hour drive down and an 8-hour drive back. And Gloria, to give you a sense of what IK-17 is like, it was built in the mid to late 1920s by Stalin. It was part of the Gulag system. It housed German POWs during the Second World War. It has not been renovated since then. Most of the roads around the camp are not paved. There are chickens and goats walking around. It is a grim, desolate place and a dangerous place for health reasons. It's well known that tuberculosis, HIV are rampant in Russian prisons and labor camps. So Paul is subject to, all the stresses, first of all, of being arrested, prosecuted, and imprisoned, but imprisoned in this godforsaken place and subject to all these other risks. So we worked very hard, both in the Trump administration and in the Biden administration, to try to get him released. And the Russians said, look, he's a spy. We caught him red-handed, and we expect something significant in return. We started talking about trading Russians who had been convicted in the United States of crimes who were in the custody of the U.S. Bureau of Prisons. None of them, the Russians told me, were their spies. They said, we've got a spy. If there's going to be a trade, it's going to be a like-for-like trade. We don't want somebody who's been convicted of a cyber crime, financial fraud, narcotics trafficking, and, in addition to making that argument, it became apparent to me that unlike for Americans or the U.S. government, the Russians didn't really care about the Russians who were incarcerated in the United States. We, on the other hand, at the U.S. Embassy, spent a huge amount of time, not just on Paul's case, but on all the other Americans who've been convicted, making sure that they're treated fairly, they have what they need, and health concerns. Fast forward, more Americans are detained after Paul is arrested. Trevor Reed, Brittany Griner, Evan Gershkovich, and the discussions between the United States and Russia got more complex as a result. The Russians maintained their position that, in Paul's case, having been convicted of espionage, they expected someone or something significant in return. For Evan's case, Evan Gershkovich, he was also convicted of espionage. So now they have two Americans American spies, as they call them, which is not so. So what we witnessed last week was we had to expand, we, the United States, the scope of our negotiations with the Russians to include other countries that had Russians that they would consider worth trading their two American spies for. And that's what unfolded last week.
Thank you. Do you think that Russia grabs people essentially as hostages against further future trades? Is that the purpose? Because otherwise it would seem to backfire, certainly in international opinions and attitudes.
So what they do is, my experience is, the short answer to your question, Gloria, is yes, but they're careful about how they do it. They will arrest someone. Brittany Griner, for example, acknowledged that she had trace amounts of marijuana in her luggage. We've had other Americans arrested in similar circumstances, a teacher at the Anglo-American school, Mark Fogel. So there's always some hook. We had a case where an American brought mistakenly an unloaded handgun in his luggage. Happens all the time at airports around the United States. People get in trouble for it. But in Russia, what happens is, when the Russian government, the Ministry of the Interior, and particularly FSB, discovered that an American has done something wrong, maybe not even criminal, but something wrong, that case will then get converted. Well, first of all, it will be overseen by the FSB, the security services, and the case will be recharacterized to be made more significant. So in Brittany Griner's case, it was narcotics trafficking. to a crime that would allow the Russians to impose a lengthy sentence. So Brittany Griner got a 9-year prison sentence for a quote crime unquote that in the United States wouldn't be punished, or if it were, it would be some citation and maybe a modest fine. In most states, it's not even a crime to have the trace amounts of marijuana that she has. So here's the model Gloria, the way to think about this is, if you're an American in Moscow and you jaywalk, I'm in New York City today. If I jaywalk here and there's a New York City police officer on the other side of the street, he's probably not even going to notice. And if he does, he may say, "Hey, watch yourself. Don't get hit by a taxi, kid." In Moscow, you get if they realize you're an American and you jaywalk, you're not going to get a citation for jaywalking. You're going to find out that, unbeknownst to you, you were actually disrupting traffic as part of an anti-war demonstration and committing a significant crime under Russian law. And instead of getting an angry look from a police officer or maybe a $15 fine, you may wind up with a 15-year sentence. And oh, by the way, if you happen to be a gold medal winning WNBA star who's going to get a lot of publicity in the United States and generate a lot of pressure on the White House and the president to secure your release, even better. And that's when the Russians really turn up the heat.
Well, speaking of turning up the heat, the big event of your tenure, Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about the lead up. I mean, how long before the invasion were you pretty certain that it was imminent or in the offing? How did it impact you, your work? And then we'll talk about the implications for our policy in the future.
So up until the end of October of 2021, President Biden met with President Putin in June of 2021 in Geneva, their summit meeting. And from that meeting, there were several work streams, discussion groups that were formed: strategic stability, arms control, cyber issues. There had been the SolarWinds hack of the United States, cyber issues, climate issues. Secretary Kerry came to Moscow for several days in July, stayed with me, and we met with the Russians on cyber issues, getting ready for COP26. I was responsible for detainee issues, so discussing with the Russians detainee issues and potential trades. Those work streams were just getting started in the early fall of 2021, September, October, when I happened to be home on leave toward the end of October, and the intelligence services of the United States, our intelligence community, reported that there was a further significant buildup of Russian troops and personnel and military equipment around Ukraine and southwestern Russia in ways that indicated that they actually were going to invade Ukraine. There had been feints that they might do that, suggestions that they might, troop buildups in the past that turned out to be exercises, but exercises with a purpose to train to invade Ukraine. By the end of October, the intelligence community was fairly confident that Putin was going to invade Ukraine. President Biden sent our CIA director, one of my predecessors as ambassador, Bill Burns, to Moscow to deliver a message directly to the Russian government, to President Putin and his most senior aides, that we see what you're planning to do and don't do it. The consequences for Russia will be catastrophic, significant economic sanctions, et cetera. So from those meetings in early November of 2021, I and many others became convinced that Putin was going to achieve what he wanted in Ukraine, which was, as he later said, to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine and to seize territory in the Donbass and beyond, not just to reaffirm Russian sovereignty, claim sovereignty over Crimea, and in those occupied portions of the Donbass and in eastern Ukraine, but to expand that. It was either going to be Ukrainian capitulation, or they were going to use, and the Russian euphemism is military technical means, and that means an invasion. As time went on in November and December, I was convinced that he was going to invade Ukraine, because the efforts at diplomacy that the United States engaged in with our allies, in diplomacy with the Russians, it was sham diplomacy from the Russian side. They weren't actually negotiating with the West. And I'll give you examples. In mid-December, they gave me 2 draft treaties. One was going to be purportedly between the United States and Russia, and the other between NATO and Russia. As I recall, they handed them to me on a Wednesday and said they wanted to negotiate in person over these treaties in 48 hours in Geneva. And they'd handed me the treaties, and the drafts were only in Russian. And the usual protocol is, when I, as U.S. ambassador, gave an official document, even a draft, to the Russian Foreign Ministry, I presented it in our official language, English, but as a courtesy, I would always present a translation into Russian, and they would do the same. In this case, they gave us 2 draft treaties, which really weren't substantial documents. They weren't detailed treaties that one would think they might be. And they wanted to negotiate in Geneva in 48 hours. Anybody who understands how these types of negotiations might play out, the notion that we were going to translate the treaties, explain them to everyone up to the President of the United States, form a response from the United States to what they had proposed, put together a negotiating team, send them to Geneva, that we were going to do all of that in 48 hours is preposterous. But and I pointed that out to them, and they said, well, you know what? If you don't show up in Geneva, we'll make these treaties public and we'll have a press conference. So it was all for show. It was sham diplomacy. It continued into January and early February. And by that point, I was making public statements to, for example, the American Chamber of Commerce in Moscow, to U.S. business leaders. At the time, we had 1,200 U.S. businesses doing business in Russia, telling them that, look, this is going to happen. He's going to do it. And people didn't believe me. They said the typical response from, say, for example, from U.S. business leaders, people who had been, men and women who had been in Russia, many of them for decades, knew Russia well. They didn't think that Putin would do it. They said it's irrational. He's making it look like he's going to do it because he wants to pressure the United States. It's all for negotiations, and he's really not going to pull the trigger. And I said, no, he's going to pull the trigger. The negotiations are a sham. He's really going to do it. And he did. On February 24th, and it wasn't President Biden at a press conference. I forget whether it was in late January or early February, and the president will often go off script and say something that we hadn't expected him to say. And he was just musing at a press conference, and he said, yeah, Putin's going to invade. Maybe it will be a minor incursion, and then we might have difficulty rallying some of our European allies. And of course, President Zelensky of Ukraine didn't like that comment. He said something, a response, something like, Mr. President, there are no minor invasions of sovereign countries. But I was convinced that it was going to be a large scale invasion. And among other things, what told me that was, I'm not a military expert, but the Russians moved a massive amount of materiel and troops into Belarus to have what they hoped or expected would be a lightning strike south. Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, is not far from the Belarusian border to the north. they moved troops and the numbers of troops and tanks and planes that they moved into Belarus they'd never done before. And he was clearly it was going to be a large scale invasion. So I was right in predicting what Putin was going to do. I was completely wrong in my expectations about how capably the Ukrainians would resist.
So I was intrigued. You immediately, when you got the news that the invasion was underway, you moved out of Spaso House, which is the beautiful neo-colonial residence of the American ambassador in Moscow, sort of symbolic of needing to go within the embassy compound for security reasons and otherwise. Overall, what are Russian objectives in Ukraine? What's at stake in the war in Ukraine for us? And what should our approach and policy be?
Well, Putin has been very clear and has said what his war aims are, and he has never varied from them from the start of what they call the special military operation that week in February of 2022 to today. One thing Americans in particular, or even U.S. diplomats and U.S. government officials, don't do a good job of is listening. We talk at people. We project our values on other people in other countries. We think they act the way and think the way we do, and we often don't listen. Putin has been saying since before the war started that Ukraine is part of Russia, part of the so-called Ruski Mir. He has planned to reclaim, to erase this phony border, what he considers a phony border that separates the Russian Federation from Ukraine. He's called the dissolution of the Soviet Union, this great tragedy of the 20th century. And when he says that, what he's talking about, he's not lamenting the demise of Soviet communism. He's not a communist. He was never a communist. He's a KGB officer. He's not a communist. He's a Russian nationalist. What he and others like him really valued about the Soviet Union was the centralized control in Moscow over what was in the past the Russian Empire and was now in Soviet times the Soviet Union. This sprawl that's much broader than the Russian Federation is today. So the tragedy from his perspective is that when the Soviet Union collapsed, the internal boundaries of the Soviet Union, for example, it separated Russia from Ukraine. Those internal boundaries that Moscow didn't need to worry about became international boundaries that separated what he thinks are Russian people on the Ukrainian side from Russians on the Russian side. So his war aim is to erase that boundary, to restore Russian sovereignty over what he believes is Russian territory. He would have preferred to do it by negotiations and capitulation by the Ukrainians. But as I said, if they weren't going to capitulate, he was going to take it by force. So that's his war aim. And he describes it as denazifying and demilitarizing Ukraine, eliminating Ukraine as a potential security threat to the Russian Federation, and absorbing those parts of Ukraine that he considers historically, morally, spiritually part of Russia.
And bottom line, what's our interest? What's at stake here? What do we need to do?
So I'll draw everyone's memory back to 1990. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in August. In fact, this is the anniversary was just yesterday or a day before. Claimed Kuwait as the 19th province of Iraq. Iraq had significant grievances with Kuwait over a shared oil field that they had. The world, the UN Security Council, united to oppose an aggressive war started by Iraq seizing another country. The UN Security Council, people don't remember this. People think of this as George H.W. Bush's leading the coalition, which he did, which expelled Iraq from Kuwait. But that was authorized by a UN Security Council resolution that the Soviet Union voted for and the PRC abstained. An aggressive war that upset the global order such that even the Soviet Union agreed that we should oppose. So fast forward to 2022. What has the Russian Federation done? A permanent member of the UN Security Council has launched an aggressive war. What was defined at Nuremberg, and I'm happy to go into this, and I do in the book, what was defined at the Nuremberg by the Nuremberg Tribunal after the Second World War as a crime against peace. The German invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939, a crime against peace. A permanent member of the UN Security Council has waged an aggressive war, a crime against peace, to redraw borders, absorb territory by force, has either killed, wounded, driven from their homes, or driven from their country 15 million Ukrainians as a result. The threat to the United States is that the Russian Federation, Putin will not stop. Ukraine is, to be sure, the prime part of his effort to restore the Russian Empire, but he will not stop. And I draw the parallel to September 1st, 1939, and the German invasion of Poland, and the way the comparisons that could be made, the justifications that the Germans had, German grievances. It's scary how similar it is to what Putin and the Russians did in invading Ukraine. And after the war, Justice Jackson at Nuremberg basically said this, I'm paraphrasing. We, the United States, this is Jackson speaking in 1946, we tried in the last war, the Great War, what we now call the First World War, we tried to ignore what was happening on the European continent with this global war that was going on. And we failed. And we were dragged in, and it was in our security interests, our foreign policy interests, we had to be involved. We tried it again in 1939 and 40 through early December of 1941. We failed again. Of course, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th, but days later, Hitler declares war on the United States. It's another aggressive war started on the European continent. We cannot ignore it. It impacts all our NATO allies and us. It threatens our security. And I'll conclude with this thought. We spend our defense budget in the United States, if you include what is publicly known, acknowledged, and the classified portions, it's close to $1 trillion defending the United States. Who are our two principal adversaries? In the case of Russia, Putin says Russia is an enemy of the United States. We say with respect to the PRC, we're competitors, et cetera, et cetera. But Putin's upfront, Russia's an enemy of the United States. When I hear people object to spending money to help Ukraine resist Russian aggression, what are we spending $1 trillion on to defend ourselves against Russia if we're not pushing back on Russian aggression in Ukraine? They've already invaded Georgia. They're involved in the war in Syria, supporting the dictator in Damascus. They're undermining the rule of law, counterterrorism operations across the African continent. This is a malevolent force that is waging an aggressive war as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and it is in the national security interests of the United States to oppose it. And we spend a lot of money to oppose Russia. And the notion that we're quibbling about sending money to Ukraine, this isn't to support Ukraine. This is to oppose Russia. So that's my thought.
One of our audience members wants to know if there's anything we should do to try to improve relations with Russia. Is the relationship salvageable? Should we try?
So my goal as ambassador, my charge, both from President Trump and to President Biden, was to do everything I possibly could in those few areas where we could improve our relations, to do so. And I failed, but it wasn't from lack of effort. I'll give you an example. We tried to cooperate with the Russians during the pandemic. You'll recall President Trump and President Putin had a conversation, and both presidents agreed to exchange medical supplies and ventilators. And the Russians sent ventilators first to the United States. I think this was in late April of 2020. We sent similar load of ventilators later in end of May, beginning of June, 2 different shipments to Russia. The Russian ventilators turned out to be dangerous. They caught fire. A number of people were killed in hospital fires in Russia as a result. The ventilators they sent us were never used, were destroyed because they were dangerous. I had talks, the health minister of Moscow, of Russia, wanted to meet with me in Moscow. It was one of my first in-person meetings after in late July of 2020, as the restrictions in Moscow during the pandemic were being lifted. I think it was my first in-person meeting with a senior Russian government official. And it was to talk about potential cooperation between the United States and the Russian Federation on the pandemic. Who could oppose that? I was all for it. Absolutely. An area where we can work on for the betterment of humanity. I met with him. He wanted me to help get him in touch with officials at NIH, CDC, Department of Health and Human Services, try to work together vaccine research. What were other elements of the Russian government doing? Literally within days of that meeting, it may have even been the next day, major breaking news story that the Russian security services, through cyber and other espionage activities, were hacking into U.S. research on vaccines. And I said to my colleagues at the embassy, how could I possibly call people back in Washington and say, hey, let's work with the Russian health ministry when the FSB and the Russian security services are hacking our research and trying to steal it, not cooperate? It's just an example of every area where I try to work with them. We could never, ever come to a positive outcome. And space research is one of the few areas where we still have American astronauts in the International Space Station. I can count on one hand now those few areas where space is one, and that's diminishing. The space station will ultimately be replaced, and the U.S. and Russia will go their separate ways on space exploration. So, yes, I agree that we should, but our interlocutor is people in the West don't understand what they're about. The government, not the people in the country, but the government, what they're about, how they treat us, how they characterize us. We are the enemy. So it's absolutely okay for the health minister to call in the U.S. ambassador and say, help us, while we're also hacking their scientists researching vaccines. I could give you example after example of that. So, concluding thought, people ask me if we should negotiate with the Russians over Ukraine. There is nothing to negotiate. Putin is not going to change his war aims. But people misinterpret that as my saying we shouldn't be talking to them. If you tell a Westerner we're going to negotiate and let's negotiate with the Russians, it's the wrong mindset. We should talk to the Russians and, most importantly, listen to the Russians, communicate with them. But what we Westerners think of as negotiations, there is no negotiation with them. So we should talk, listen, And I would often say when I would go in on a hard issue to negotiate with the Russians, to say to my colleagues at the embassy, among the best advice I ever got was never to ask the Russians for anything because they'd view it as a sign of weakness. Never make a goodwill gesture at the start of a negotiation. It's a sign of weakness. They'll pocket it and move on. My approach was always to tell them what was important to the United States, what the United States wanted, tell them. And if it was problematic for the Russians, say it more in sorrow than in anger to let them know, say it respectfully, but to communicate that way with them. And there is anybody who talks about negotiating with the Russians over Ukraine and potential withdrawal of Russian troops from areas that they have occupied just has never dealt with this government or with Putin. It's just not the way he operates. I'm sorry to say.
No, thank you. So unfortunately, we have time for just one more question and only a couple minutes left. There's an old phrase in American diplomacy: politics stops at the water's edge, and that it should do so. You served as ambassador across two different administrations of different parties.
Yeah.
How was that? Was there a difference between the two administrations? A difference in attitude, thrust, policy, orientation? How did that work?
Yeah, it's interesting. I write about it in the book. There was a difference in the shift from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. The substance of U.S. policy toward Russia didn't really change that much from Trump to Biden. Now, there were changes, but a lot of that was because of actions that the Russians took. So, for example, when I became ambassador, the detainee that we were focused on was Paul Whelan. In the Biden administration, we had all these other Americans subsequently arrested. So policies changed, but the basic thrust of U.S. policy with respect to Russia didn't really change that much. But here's what did change, and it's more of a procedural change. My principal point of contact in Washington, the person that I looked to for guidance, instruction as ambassador, was Secretary Pompeo. I'd been his deputy. It made sense. We talked all the time. His views and my views on Russia were very similar. And during the entire time I was Donald Trump's ambassador, I never spoke to the president, not once. Wasn't even on a call with him, where I didn't speak, but he did, or a video conference. That changed dramatically in the Biden administration. I was still in frequent contact with this new Secretary of State, Secretary Blinken. I had succeeded him as deputy secretary, so he and I are friends. Don't get me wrong, I still coordinate very closely with Secretary Blinken, but I had a lot more contact with the White House and with President Biden in particular in that first year, as they were getting to know me as their ambassador in Moscow. So it was actually, Gloria, you mentioned my moving out of Spaso House after the war started. The reason for that move was I needed to be near my office. The residence was a 12, 15-minute drive. My conversations and video conferences with Washington were round the clock after the war started, and with an 8-hour time difference, and they were all with the White House. State Department was participating. So bottom line, the shift from Trump to Biden was my focus back in Washington when expanded from just the State Department to the White House and NSC-led process with President Biden at the top.
So we are out of time. I wanted to thank you, John. And I want to say one last thing. I know that you were separated from your wife during the time you served in Moscow, and it was her cancer diagnosis and imminent death that actually brought you back to
Yeah.
to Washington. And so sorry, and sorry you had to serve that time alone, and also that she passed away. And you've had the sadness of not being with her those last 3 years all the time, and so on. So thank you for your service, and particularly thank you for going through that personal calamity while you were serving our country.
Well, you're kind to say Gloria, and as I write in the book, I had a number of colleagues at Embassy Moscow who were, as we like to call ourselves, geographic bachelors and bachelorettes who had family back home that couldn't be there with us, and some of whom had relatives die, parents. So I would say that it's a hardship post for a reason, and I was just one of the Americans at Embassy Moscow who sacrificed to serve our country and represent us there.
Well, again, condolences and thank you for your service. For our audience, our thanks to Ambassador John Sullivan, author of Midnight in Moscow, a memoir from the front lines of Russia's war against the West. We encourage everyone to pick up Midnight in Moscow, which I have read. It's a great book at your local bookstore. If you'd like to watch more programs and support the Commonwealth Club's efforts, please visit us, commonwealthclub.org/events. And of course, we have a lovely waterfront headquarters in San Francisco. If you're in the Bay Area, there are events every day. We'd love to have you stop by and join us in person. I'm Gloria Duffy. Thank you, and see you next time.